Welcome to Military Analytics. Belarus is one of the most critical actors in the war between Ukraine and Russia. While Lukashenko is afraid of confronting Ukraine and getting involved in the war, he is also afraid of conflicting with Putin. This situation divides the Belarusian army and the Belarusian people into two, especially the Belarusian fighters fighting against the Russians in the Ukrainian army. And the rebel anti-war groups in Belarus are taking action against the policies of both Putin and Lukashenko. While this undermines Lukashenko's authority, it also worries Putin. Belarus has an important place in Putin's plans. But Lukashenko's latest move could upset Putin's plans. A blow came from Belarus to the Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who destroyed his image of the strong man, the pillar of his 20-year rule with the Ukraine war. After a year of Russia's war against all of Ukraine, there is no sign that the conflict will end anytime soon. On the contrary, while observers worried about Russia launching a new major attack on Ukraine, the balance was shaken when Vladimir Putin was shot in the back by his closest ally. Lukashenko, who met with Russian President Vladimir Putin at regular intervals, took measures against Russia, against the fact that his people felt the war concerns at the highest level and caused a possible rebellion movement. While the tension in the war is constantly escalating, Belarus decides to close its borders to the Russians in a very critical move against Russia. Belarusian self-proclaimed President Alexander Lukashenko held a meeting on current security issues and measures to protect the state border, citing alleged provocations at the border and infiltration saboteurs. In this direction, temporary border control was started on the Russian border in Belarus. According to information published by Belarusian national news sources and a link to the State Border Committee, Belarus has launched temporary controls on the border of the Russian Federation. Correspondents on the helpline of the State Border Committee were told that border control would be implemented at all main entrances from Russia. The organization of these events is connected with the implementation of the ratification agreement between Russia and Belarus on mutual recognition of visas. Currently, control is carried out in 6 main directions and concerns only entry into the territory of Belarus. The representative of the State Border Committee stated that the introduction of border control is a temporary measure, but has not yet determined exactly when it will be completed. The introduced control will be valid until further notice. Temporary border control was initiated between Belarus and Russia and checkpoints were established. Queues are reported at the border, especially on the M1 highway. The Russians are most thoroughly controlled. At the same time, everyone is unloaded from their cars and searched in detail, and their documents are recorded. As it is known, Lukashenko kept away from the direct participation of Belarus in the war from the beginning. However, step by step, Russia's efforts to draw them into the war and taking more sides in Ukraine left them alone with the fear of escalating public anger towards Lukashenko. The invasion of Russia was never considered a positive development for Belarus, which shares a border of about 1,000 kilometers with Ukraine and has many citizens with family or personal ties there. But while Lukashenko agreed to deploy some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons in his country, he viewed the move as a protection against what he described as NATO's aggressive plans and Western conspiracies against his government. The deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus was a major move towards escalation of the war in Ukraine. We can say that Lukashenko, who was worried about the expansion of the war against Ukraine towards its own borders and even inside, took a step back. After all, Belarus' few tactical nuclear weapons are of little military importance. After all, Russia has similar weapons in the Kaliningrad enclave. This is a new attempt to intimidate Ukraine and especially the West, and further escalate the conflict. In a nutshell, a return to habits from the worst days of the Cold War. But then the Soviet Union, which Putin wanted to revive today, was not only making nuclear threats, but also invading the states they wanted to control. However, events continue to develop in the opposite direction. Putin's biggest problem is that if he uses nuclear weapons, the West will respond on the basis of reciprocity. Therefore, the probability of using nuclear weapons in Europe is very low. At least under the current circumstances, where the Russian army is somehow still in Ukraine. Experts say that if Ukrainian troops advance into Crimea, the risk of Russia using nuclear weapons will increase significantly. But since the Russian president started his clumsy war more than 13 months ago, he continues to help the Western public. Kyiv, which is not very accustomed to the logic of the Cold War, to Kyiv, thus staying calm, ensuring coordination among the allies, and providing prudent responses will be the only response to prevent the Russian strategy, which is relying on the specter of nuclear holocaust from giving Moscow victories it would not normally achieve with its exhausted army on the battlefield. On the other hand, new problems arise for Russia, where the dark clouds never go over. Accidents on the Russian railways caused local disruptions in the movement of military trains. This led to increased pressure on Russia's internal security forces. Most likely, Russia will not be able to fully protect its railways from repeated attacks. The recent increase in Russian rail accidents in areas bordering Ukraine attributed to sabotage by unknown actors almost certainly caused short-term local disruptions to Russian military rail movements. These events were noted to increase the pressure on Russia's internal security forces. Although the rail brigades quickly restored rail service, considering the point reached in the war, the chaos and heavy losses that the Russian leader dragged his country into became intolerable for the Kremlin, and it started to pose a big problem. Russia's reputation was shaken. The missiles were spawned from a low altitude that radars cannot detect at 2.5 times the speed of sound, challenging the 94 seconds that the Russian defense system can respond. This is an embarrassment for President Vladimir Putin, his commanders, and for Russia. As of now, Ukraine's high-tech three-man team is receiving coordinates and information for Russia. From now on, Russia's job is much more difficult. When we think about Ukraine's self-confidence, the support of the West and the USA, and the upcoming big Ukrainian offensive, it looks like there will be much more difficult days for Russia as a result. Russia's attack on Ukraine has united the West, and now more states need to get on board. This war was not only limited to Ukraine, but also changed the security perception of the whole world. The only way to have a strong, free, and developed Ukraine is the defeat of Russia. We can say that the fact that other countries which are concerned about Russian aggression and have taken sides with the principle of neutrality until now have shown us how far the Ukraine war has reached. Ukraine's survival. Putin's defeat. This view prevails throughout the West, but one last push is needed. We are just at the beginning of a difficult process, and no one, not even the most hopeful optimists, can see a ray of light in favor of Russia at the end of the tunnel. However, thanks to the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people to Russian aggression, we have the most important thing, the tunnel itself. We know that no matter what Putin does, he will not be able to restore the Russian Empire. Yes, the war will still go on. A brutal, long, terrible, unrelenting war. Ukraine's war of independence. A war that they won't stop until the end. After all, an empire for Russia, that seems entirely unlikely. Russia, on paper, has one of the strongest armies in the world. It was assumed that the Russian army had special forces and capabilities in the air, land, and sea area. However, in the 13-month war, nothing but the cries of the Russian soldiers appeared. The Russian army had failed in both land and air and naval battles to discover what happened behind the scenes of the war. We must first state that the losses of the Russian army reach almost 180,000, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. This number of casualties does not even reach 20,000. So if the losses of the Russians were so low, why did the soldiers of the 155th Marine Brigade come to support the clashes in the city of Boulder? It is quite tragic that the Russians, who stated that they had no problems in sending soldiers to the front, sent their Navy personnel to this killing zone. Let's take a look at the latest situation on the Bakhmut front in order to discover the answer to these critical questions. Russia's problems in finding soldiers to take to the front caused one of the most elite units of the Russian naval forces to be disintegrated in the Donetsk region. It is the first time that the soldiers of the Russian naval forces have received such a heavy blow during the war in Ukraine. You may remember that the soldiers of the 155th Marine Brigade of the Russian Army went to support the clashes in the city of Volodar in the Donetsk region in the last clash that took place in the city. The Russian Marine Brigade lost more than 1,100 soldiers. Volodya's minefields became a graveyard for Russian naval forces. The final situation of this departed Russian naval unit has become deplorable. With the collapse of the Russian brigade, the soldiers of the Ukrainian Navy started a comprehensive operation to destroy this brigade. This huge operation, which started when Volodya came under the control of the Ukrainians, included the bombing of the underground bunkers of the Russian soldiers in the city and the meticulous search of every place. Troops of the Ukrainian Navy destroyed 15 Russian soldiers and the Russian battle tank. As a result of this operation, in addition, dozens of Russian soldiers had to surrender to the Ukrainian forces with the operation. Who were among these surrendered soldiers? We think you have guessed the answer to this question. 11 soldiers from the 155th Separate Guards, Marine Brigade of the Russian Pacific Fleet surrendered to the armed forces of Ukraine during operations in the region. And even the Ukrainian journalist Andriy Tsoplenko published a video of the interrogation of prisoners of war from the 155th Naval Brigade who survived the war. The second part of the video showing the soldiers of the other neutralized Russian Naval Brigade was also published on social media. According to the latest information, in addition to the Russian soldiers who surrendered from the Naval Brigade, hundreds of others who were also members of this brigade were killed as a result of the striking operation of the Ukrainian Navy forces. The footage of the defeat of the Russian troops in the Volodar area showed that the Russian forces were using extremely ineffective tactics. Although this heavy defeat indicated that the 155th Russian Brigade was most likely composed of untrained soldiers, it was claimed that the unit consisted of highly elite soldiers before the Naval Brigade suffered a record number of casualties. On the other hand, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces reported that the command and personnel of the brigade, which was defeated near Vologda, now refused to launch a new attack because the Naval Brigade was almost completely destroyed by the soldiers of the Ukrainian Navy. In addition, after the striking heavy defeat, serious conflicts began to occur between the administrative level and military leaders in Russia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin had given the rank of Colonel General to the Eastern Military District Commander Muratov for a report on the successes of the 155th Separate Guards Marine Brigade in the direction of Volodar. But due to the heavy losses of the Russian Naval Brigade, now Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu demands that this general calculate his rank and take the city at any cost. While the soldiers of the Ukrainian naval forces broke up a unit of the Russian Navy, the confrontation between the Russian administration and the most experienced generals of the Russian armed forces had a very negative impact on the situation on the Ukrainian front lines, especially in Bakhmut. The Russians, who made progress in the last days, began to be shaken after the failure in volatile situations in Bakhmut have also changed over time. Ukrainians expressed that they will defend the city at all costs. In the statement made by the Office of the President of Ukraine on the subject, it was clearly stated that the defense of Bakhmut, where fierce clashes with Russia continues, will continue. Bakhmut was discussed at the high-level meeting chaired by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Among the participants were head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, head of the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense, Kyrylo Budanov, Chief of the General Staff of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Alexei Danilov, and unit commanders and law enforcement officials. After the meeting, it was stated that the Ukrainian Presidential Office revealed the course of the defense operation in the Bakhmut region, and all the officials attending the meeting expressed a common position on the further holding and defense of the city of Bakhmut. It was also stated that the supply of weapons and ammunition to the units on the front line was discussed. It was emphasized that the speed and size of the equipment and weapons deliveries sent to Ukraine from their allies and their distribution among the troop groups were also discussed at the meeting. Zaluzhny, the chief of the General Staff of Ukraine, stated that the defense of Bakhmut is of extremely strategic importance. On the other hand, Russia seized Bakhmut, where fierce fighting continues, as a stepping stone to advance to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, two major cities in the Donetsk region. Although the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut were surrounded on three sides, they have yet to show any signs of retreat. So why is Bakhmut important to Ukraine and Russia? Actually, Bakhmut is in ruins. The small industrial city in eastern Ukraine has been the target of Russian troops for more than 7 months. According to the city's deputy mayor, Oleksandr Marchenko, only a few thousand people remained in Bakhmut. They, too, live in underground bunkers without electricity, gas or water. Russia and Ukraine are too insistent on waging war fiercely around these piles of rubble. Both sides put out their many soldiers to attack or protect the city. Military analysts, on the other hand, consider Bakhmut to have little strategic value. In fact, Bakhmut is not a garrison city, nor is it a transportation hub or a city with a large population. Before the occupation, it was a place where approximately 70,000 people lived. It was best known for its massive winery, along with its salt and gypsum mines. It has no particular geographical significance. But as a Western official said, Bakhmut is a small but strategic and important tactical event on a 1,200-kilometer front line. For this reason, Russia is using its military resources on a large scale to seize the city. Western officials estimate that between 20 to 30,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or injured in Bakhmut so far. The Kremlin needs a victory, albeit a symbolic one. It has been quite some time since the summer when Russian forces captured cities such as Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The territorial gains the Russians have made since then have been gradual and slow. That's why Russia needs success to continue its pro-Kremlin propaganda in the country. Russian commanders also have military reasons for capturing Bakhmut. They hope that the city can be a stepping stone to further land acquisition, as the UK Department of Defense stated in December. The takeover of the city will allow Russia to threaten larger and wider urban areas such as Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. And of course, there is the issue of Wagner, Russia's mercenary group, which is at the center of the attacks. Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, risked both his own reputation and his private army in the capture of Bakhmut. He hoped to show that his mercenaries could do better than the Russian army. He included thousands of prisoners in his army. Many of these people who fought with the Ukrainian defense units died. If he does not succeed here, Prigozhin's political influence in Moscow will also weaken. Prigozhin is also at odds with the Russian defense minister. In other words, Bakhmut witnesses so many important and countless clashes because it is a front line that swallows the Russians in the Donetsk region, both politically and militarily. The hottest part of the front line was the backward direction. The Russian presidential office announced that they received the message of the head of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, who threatened to withdraw from Bakhmut in the coming days. As a result, Putin forced the Ministry of Defense to give unlimited supplies to Wagner Group and full autonomy over the entire direction. The same day, Ukrainian intelligence noted a significant movement of Russian forces towards Bakhmut. Russians relocated thousands of troops to the second line in preparation for a massive storm in operation today. Ukrainians unleashed their hammers and conducted the most extensive HIMARS raid of the war. A fighter from the 24th Assault Brigade reported that the strikes continued the whole day and were also supported by aviation and other long-range artillery, such as M327. Another fighter reported that hammer strikes were distinctly concentrated in at least 3 areas and also provided support on demand. One such area became the home of a region. 2 days ago, Ukrainians launched an extensive operation in this region that culminated today at night. As you remember, previously, the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade was conducting an operation to clear the trenches in between the 2 roads. 2 days ago, this became the area of responsibility of the Special Forces Detachment Terror. The main goal of this detachment was to breach Russian positions in a fortified shelter, destroy the enemy troops, and create conditions for further advancement. Geolocated combat footage shows that the fighters prepared specific equipment in order to achieve their objective. Apart from the abundance of grenades, the fighters had powerful explosives that they detonated from a distance. As a result, the task was completed and they started preparing for the next move. Today, the commander of this detachment reported that they were conducting offensive actions from 4 a.m. till midnight. He said that in the aftermath of this extensive operation, Ukrainians have advanced by 1 kilometer forward, which means that at the moment, both heavily entrenched fields are under total Ukrainian control. And Russians once again lost control over the home of the road. Other fighters commented that such progress was achieved thanks to the coordination with the HIMARS crews that have been hidden in the shelters occupied by Russians, which the infantry struggled to bridge themselves. Ukrainian artillery also intensely shelled and targeted Russians inside Bakhmut itself. Ukrainian fighters reported that after several days of using incendiary munitions, Russian forces assumed that the Ukrainian positions in the citadel worsened and conducted several waves of attacks. Russian sources claimed that Wagner units launched a large-scale operation and started attacking along the whole contact line, while Ukrainian fighters wrote that even though there were indeed a lot of ground attacks during the day, they did not happen at once. The fighters said that Russians presented several assault units in each direction to test waters. They would be eliminated by snipers and finished by mortar crews, and then Russians would send another group, which continued the whole day. One of the main axes of advance became the northeastern side of the citadel. Several days ago, Russians managed to get across the street and establish control over a high-rise building. Shortly, Russian sources published a description of a new Russian tactic, which is indeed quite impressive. These standard Soviet houses only have windows in front and in the back and do not have windows on the sides. In order to avoid Ukrainian fire, Wagner forces started blowing up the side walls on the first and second floors, immediately penetrating Ukrainian defenses from the most unexpected and vulnerable side. As a result, they established control over the outer building of the citadel. But unfortunately for the Russians, Ukrainians blew up the whole building after retreating. Ukrainians then also hit with artillery, a Russian machine gun nest which suppressed Ukrainian fire and allowed Wagners to approach the building from the side. Another main axis of advance became Ukrainian positions on the outer edge of the city. These positions are extremely important because they do not allow Russians to take Rome over and cut off Ukrainians from the west. In fact, this is where Ukrainian artillery and mortar crews were helping out forces on the ground the most. Ukrainian fighters from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade showed how they basically fired at Russian positions non-stop, and their joint effort paid off very quickly because, as reported by the fighters on the ground, Russians started hiding in houses and basements, and then the survivors retreated. Overall, Russian forces struggled to breach the last Ukrainian defense line in Bakhmut. The only progress that Russians managed to achieve over the last 10 days is establishing control over a small block of houses in the northwest and a line of high-rise buildings east of the citadel. The Institute for the Study of War evaluated the Prigozhin drama and essentially concluded that his blackmail was not a show, but rather an attempt to secure a seat in the Ministry of Defense to get more intelligence about the Ukrainian counteroffensive and secure unlimited supplies to meet the Ukrainian counteroffensive. As if he understood that Putin simply could not allow an effective defeat to happen on the biggest Russian holiday. And as a result, he got everything he wanted. Today, Prigozhin basically confirmed this analysis by saying that he needed a lot of ammunition to conduct the biggest storming operation, clear Bakhmut, and regroup to meet the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Fortunately, Ukrainian intelligence timely noted a huge inflow of troops and equipment and responded with yet unseen ferocity.